ำหรับในหัวข้อนี้นะคะจะเป็นการพูดถึงเรื่องของ climate change เรื่องนี้สำคัญมากๆซึ่งเราจะมีวิธีการรับมือการหลีกเลี่ยงนะคะแล้วก็ป้องกันปัญหานี้ได้อย่างไรนะคะเดี๋ยวเราจะมาเรียนรู้แนวทางกันนะคะว่าเราจะสามารถปฏิบัติอย่างไรนำไปใช้อย่างไรกันบ้างในหัวข้อดังกล่าวนี้เลยกับ climate change is the world on track to avoid dangerous climate change ตอนนี้โลกของเรากำลังเดินหน้าเข้าสู่การหลีกเลี่ยงภัยอันตรายของ climate change หรือว่าภัยโลกร้อนอยู่หรือเปล่ามันชัดเจนมากเลยว่าแน่นอนเรากำลังอยู่ในจุดนั้นนะคะเพราะฉะนั้นเดี๋ยวสำหรับในการบรรยายนี้ก็รอฟังกันได้เลยว่าเราจะมีสาระน่ารู้นะคะอะไรกันบ้างแล้วก็อะไรที่เราสามารถนำไปปฏิบัติใช้ได้จริง Alright now ladies and gentlemen as for this session allow me to introduce to you our speaker he is the director of policy at the Grantham Research Institute ladies and gentlemen Mr. Bob Ward ขอเสียงปรบมือให้กับท่านด้วยค่ะ
Much indeed, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak to you this evening. I wish I was there in Bangkok with you. I'm sure it's warmer there than it is here in London at the moment. But I'm very grateful for the opportunity to join you virtually from London this evening to talk about this issue. Is the world on track to avoid dangerous climate change? So I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes and then hopefully leave some time for questions and discussion. So let's get going. This image, by the way, is one I've taken from a Thai newspaper earlier this month, showing flooding on the streets of Bangkok, just to emphasize that there isn't anywhere in the world at the moment that isn't being exposed to the impacts of climate change. But of course, we've seen some very dramatic impacts all around the world over the past few years and indeed in the past month. And I've just selected one major event, which has been the flooding that's been taking place in Pakistan to highlight. It was reported to have received more than 3 times its usual rainfall in August this year, the wettest August since 1961, and 2 of its southern provinces, Sindh and Balochistan, were particularly badly affected, receiving 7 and 8 times their usual monthly total for August. The Indus River burst its banks, causing flooding across thousands of square kilometers, causing flooding and of course landslides. And so far, 33 million people have been affected by the floods. 1.7 million homes have been destroyed and nearly 1,500 people died. And sadly, we expect the number of people who've died to go up. The World Weather Attribution has had a look at the rainfall patterns and has concluded from modeling that the rainfall in those 2 southern provinces is 75% more intense now as a result of the warming of the earth we've seen of 1.2 degrees. And so it's a very clear indication for these kinds of extreme weather events that they are becoming more intense and more frequent as a result of climate change. The impacts are here and happening now, and they're damaging lives and livelihoods around the world. This is all part of a pattern of extreme weather being affected by climate change. And I want to highlight here the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the world's most reputable source of information about climate change, recently published its 6th assessment report. Its first part of it was published last August 2021. And its summary for policymakers pointed out that human-induced climate change is already affecting many weather and climate extremes in every single region across the globe. Those include, for instance, the frequency and intensity of heavy rainfall events have increased since the 1950s, as have indeed the global proportion of major tropical cyclones. And we have indeed just seen in the past few days Super Typhoon Noru affecting the Philippines and now heading for the coast of Vietnam. And we've also got a major hurricane in the just appearing in the Gulf of Mexico in North America are likely to hit the coast of Florida later on this week. On the right-hand side of the screen, you can see a representation of the world, showing how these various rainfall and extreme hot weather in the top one. This is extreme rainfall affecting many different parts of the world so far. So all these impacts happening around the world we can see and are attributable to climate change. Of course, this is all the result linked to a warming pattern. And here are three graphs showing the warming in various ways. The first on your top left is the global average temperature as measured by various authorities around the world, including the UK Met Office and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in the United States. Very clear warming, particularly since the 1970, unequivocal, and we've seen warming of about 1.2 Celsius degrees since the late 19th century. The graph on the bottom left-hand side shows what happens if you try to model that warming just using just taking account of natural factors such as changes in the sun's intensity. Essentially, that, and you'll see in the right panel of that bottom left hand, you'll see that there's a green graph which is showing what happens if you just take into account natural factors, and there would have been no warming so far. You can only get the warming if you take into account human activities, primarily emissions of greenhouse gases. And then on the right hand side there, you see the trend in Thailand's average temperature, very clear warming, showing the same trend as we're seeing globally and indeed in every region around the world. So it's obvious that warming is happening all across the planet. And of course, this warming is primarily driven by emissions of greenhouse gases. On the left-hand side, you'll see the concentrations, atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide, which are being measured. Carbon dioxide is the main greenhouse gas, primarily produced by the burning of fossil fuels. And essentially, we are now seeing concentrations in the atmosphere reaching about 420 parts per million, which is compared to 280 parts per million, which was the concentration before industrialization, which means a 50% increase. The middle panel shows you the emissions of carbon dioxide from burning of fossil fuels each year. And you'll see that for the most recent year, 2021, the world emitted 36.4 billion tons of carbon dioxide. That's what's driving the increase in concentrations. On the right-hand side, you'll see what happens if you add in all the other greenhouse gases, and you essentially were seeing almost 60 billion tons of greenhouse equivalent of carbon dioxide emitted into the atmosphere every year. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, again, has looked at where we're going, not just where we've been. So we've seen warming of 1.2 degrees so far, and it's concluded that basically on current trends by mid-century, we're likely to see warming of 1.5 degrees and even 2 degrees by the end of the century on current trends, without very big cuts in greenhouse gas emissions. And there's a rather frightening statistic that at the bottom there, highlighted in bold. The last time global average temperature was 2.5 degrees higher than pre-industrial levels was over 3 million years ago. Remember that modern humans only appeared on Earth about between 200 and 250,000 years ago. So we're talking about creating a climate potentially by the end of this century, which we have no historical experience of, and we have no experience of as a species. So anybody that tells you that that's not something to worry about really hasn't grasped the enormity of the situation. And it's pointed out that if we get that warming trend of 1.5 degrees or even 2 degrees by the end of the century, we'll see increasing impacts around the world, a reduction in glacier ice, in the ice sheets, the major ice sheets in Greenland and in Antarctica, as well as the sea ice in the Arctic, widespread impacts, and that those impacts will be far greater if we get warming of 2 degrees compared to 1.5 degrees. At 1.5 degrees, we'll see heavy rainfall and associated rainfall in almost every region, including, of course, in Asia, where, of course, we're already seeing major increases in heavy rainfall, including, of course, in Thailand and Bangkok. And at 2 degrees, we'll see even bigger increases in heavy rainfall events and droughts. Now, I highlight those temperatures of 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees because, of course, the world is recognized the dangers associated with those. And we had the landmark Paris Agreement in 2015, in which all countries of the world agreed that we should be limiting greenhouse gases so that we keep the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees and pursue our efforts to keep that rise to 1.5 degrees. Remember, we've already seen 1.2 degrees of warming, so we're getting very, very close already to that 1.5 degree threshold. What that means is we need to see greenhouse gas emissions peak as soon as possible. They're still rising at the moment. There are suggestions that carbon dioxide might be leveling off. So we need a peak as soon as possible. And then we need to essentially reduce emissions so that they are balanced by any kind of removals of greenhouse gases from human activities, such as planting of trees and vegetation, essentially reducing emissions to zero no later than the second half of this century. And the Paris Agreement agrees every country to make their own efforts and to document them in nationally determined contributions. What we saw at the last United Nations Climate Change Summit in Glasgow last November was a reaffirmation by countries to those goals of the Paris Agreement, but also a recognizing just how far we are from being on track with on a pathway that would limit warming. So the science indicates that what we will need to do is reduce our annual emissions of carbon dioxide essentially by 45% by 2030 relative to its 2010 level, and to reach net zero around mid-century, to limit to 1.5 degrees. And that at the moment, those nationally determined contributions, if you add them up, would mean carbon dioxide levels which would be not 45% lower by 2030, but actually 13%, 7% higher in 2030 than they were in 2010. So we're some way off being on track to meet that 1.5 degree target. This diagram emphasizes that again. It's a complicated one on the right hand side, but what it shows is essentially we're a big gap of essentially 25 billion tons estimated by 2030, the gap in our annual emissions between the 1.5 degree pathway and where we would be with our conditional nationally determined contributions. And as a result, in Glasgow, countries recognize that they need to come back before the next UN summit, which is due to be held in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt in November this year, that every country should come back with more ambitious pledges. And we're not really seeing that at the moment. What we really need is for the big emitters in particular to do more to reduce their emissions. China is the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases, as this panel on the left-hand side shows, followed by the United States, Europe, and India. And although the US and Europe have been reducing their emissions, they need to reduce their emissions far more quickly than they are. The main cause of the rise in emissions, of course, are the burning of fossil fuels. Coal is the worst. Coal is the biggest single contributor to emissions. The burning of coal primarily for electricity generation, but also for other industrial processes, followed by oil, which is primarily we use for transport, and then natural gas, which we use increasingly for electricity generation as well. So it's the burning of fossil fuels that is driving climate change. It's that which we need to rapidly accelerate away from and find alternatives. Now, fortunately, we have many alternatives to using fossil fuels. This is from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report on mitigation, which was published in April this year. And they pointed out that the unit costs of production of many low carbon alternatives to fossil fuels, such as solar panels and onshore wind and offshore wind, they've also all dropped dramatically in prices over the past few years. Between 2010 and 2019, the unit cost of solar energy have declined by 85%. Of wind power, they've dropped by 55%. Lithium-ion batteries, which we need for electricity storage, have dropped by 85%. And there have been massive increases in deployment of these technologies and other technologies such as electric vehicles all around the world. However, it is not happening on the scale yet that we really need to rapidly phase out fossil fuels. So we have to increase our efforts to deploy these technologies and phase out fossil fuels. Now, fossil fuels is also giving us another problem, which is the cost of energy more generally, as a result of the sluggishness in the response of the supply of fossil fuels following the pandemic and the lifting of lockdowns. And also, of course, now that we have a conflict in Ukraine caused by Russia's illegal invasion, we see on the left-hand side some graphs from the International Monetary Fund showing how food and energy prices have been going up in the past year, and in particular fossil fuel prices. That bottom panel on the left-hand side shows you some of the main indexes: Brent crude oil, natural gas and coal, all going up, all driving a big increase in the cost of energy and the cost of living. And as a result, the IMF has pointed out that this is driving inflation around the world, which is likely to cause a big drop in global output as a result. So not only are fossil fuels causing increasing damage around the world through the impacts of climate change and, of course, air pollution, but it is also now proving unsustainable in the economy and causing us, the huge costs are causing us, are damaging our prospect for growth around the world. The International Energy Agency has pointed out that renewables are also increasing in cost because you use fossil fuels at the moment in order to create the infrastructure for renewables. But nevertheless, renewables still remain cheaper in most parts of the world as a source of energy than fossil fuels. So it makes sense, not just for tackling climate change, which is damaging lives and livelihoods around the world, but it makes sense to get off fossil fuels and get onto renewables in order to drive forward economic growth around the world and to raise living standards. So there really is no argument for being slow in the transition. It makes sense on many levels economically and in order to advance living standards and to tackle poverty around the world, to accelerate the transition away from fossil fuels towards low carbon alternatives. So the conclusions, let me just wrap up what I've been telling you this morning. We're already experiencing dangerous climate change impacts around the world after warming of just 1.2 degrees. It's been obvious everywhere, including, of course, in Bangkok. These impacts are growing and harming lives and livelihoods around the world, particularly through sea level rise, but also changes in the frequency and severity of extreme weather events such as heavy rainfall, heat waves, and droughts. All countries have agreed to limit warming to well below 2 degrees through the Paris Agreement, but there is growing evidence that we should be going even further and trying limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, which requires the world really to get to net zero emissions by the middle of this century if we're to avoid unacceptable impacts. Current pledges, though, that have been put forward by countries for emission cuts by 2030 are not consistent with that 1.5 pathway, and indeed are more consistent with us seeing warming of more than 2 degrees by the end of the century, which would have very damaging consequences around the world. If we really want to meet those targets, we have to phase out fossil fuels much more quickly and also end deforestation. Deforestation is also a major driver of climate change. But fortunately, zero carbon technologies, many of which are being showcased in Bangkok during this expo, are falling in price and are now cheaper than fossil fuels in many places, offering us all around the world, not only greater energy affordability, but greater energy security and greater sustainability. So thank you very much indeed for your time, and I'm very happy to answer any questions you may have.
ค่ะขอเสียงปรบมือให้กับสปีกเกอร์ของเราด้วยนะคะคุณบ๊อบวอร์ด Thank you very much Mr. Bob Ward. Were you saying that if any audience have any questions?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Does anyone have any questions for our speaker? Yes. Okay. No. So thank you very much once again, Bob, for your concern on the climate change. That was very informative. ขอเสียงปรบมือให้กับท่านอีกครั้งหนึ่งนะคะ Thank you very much. ขอบคุณค่ะ from Thailand. All right. So that is the climate change concerns and issues. That is very informative, and thank you very much for being with us here today, Bob.